doubt about it. Civil society plays, I think, a really kind of complex role in some ways in driving social and political change. We see that in the sense of the big heading items, issues such as the climate crisis and so on, where it's not an understatement to say that the movement, spearheaded in a large part by young people around the need for climate action, was pivotal in getting the type of people elected into the European Parliament who were elected last time round, in getting more environmental campaigners elected to governments throughout Europe. And as a result now, the green agenda, as it were, is very much centre stage in our debates and dialogues. That's a big heading item at home. We see civil society leading the call for change in issues like the marriage referendum, reproductive rights, and so on. So in its broadest sense, I suppose, it's probably fair to say that politicians don't lead. They generally follow. They don't follow quick enough, but they respond to an agenda from the public. And I think civil society embodies that, because there's been a bit of a sort of an attempt to say that these movements can kind of develop overnight, almost that they come out of nowhere. But the reality is that it's civil society organizations which have over many years molded and adapted public attitudes, which wouldn't have changed without committed, motivated people working over the years to build those movements. So it can seem like change is quick, but in actual fact, it comes from the hard slog on the ground. And I think one of the issues that is very important is that civil society can counteract, and this is particularly important in an EU sense, the influence of corporate lobbyists, but also hold politicians to account. And from my own point of view as an MEP, civil society actors and are really important to us from the point of view of guidance and expertise. If you look at the big civil liberties of the day, I'm on the LIBE committee, which is the Justice Committee, and some of the big issues, maybe not so much for Ireland, but certainly across Europe, are issues like migration and border violence. And the truth is that without committed activists on the ground in Europe's borders, organisations like the Border Violence Monitoring Network or Are You Serious, documenting what's going on in the ground, they have been absolutely pivotal in shaping the EU's policy, in ensuring that we're monitoring human rights violations and so on. Without them, actually Brussels would be blind without their work on the ground. And the same goes for our work here on issues like militarism, in terms of trade union issues, community issues. We work with groups like Untashka, Birdwatch, the Environmental Pillar, Trócaire, Concern, Christian Aid. All of these groups give valuable information. And in a European sense, there are many European civil society organisations, freedom of journalists, the Corporate Europe Observatory, and we depend on the knowledge and base that these trusted civil society organisations have built up in order to direct and inform our work. And I think that's key. The world is grappling clearly now, and the EU, in a post-COVID era. One of the key issues where I saw a huge change come about was the sad and unfortunate attitude of both the US initially and the European Union in failing to back the calls from India and South Africa to release the TRIPS waiver, which is the patent put on vaccines. There is a clause in World Trade Agreements which allows, in particular emergencies, the private ownership of property rights to be released in the common good. So to release the waivers and allow the genetic reproduction of a vaccine, which is the only way in which the global south will get access. And in actual fact, by making those people safer, we're making ourselves safer, and we're allowing Europe and the world reopen quicker. That mechanism was blocked, but there was a huge campaign led by civil society organisations right across the EU, which put the pressure on the European Parliament and member states and so on. So with the great result that in the last 2 weeks or so, we saw a huge reversal where the European Parliament supported the call for the lifting of the TRIPS waiver, which is a key in terms of levelling the playing field between the global north and south and reopening after the pandemic. So I think that gives you an idea of how your voice can be heard if you shout loud enough, that you can get to Europe's ear. We see it in even other ways. There's been a big campaign now, a citizens-led initiative to end the caging of animals. And again, that's got a popular call here because of the systemic lobbying by civil society organizations. So on the one hand, you've issues, if you like, being spearheaded ahead of the curve. Civil society is always ahead of the curve. And the EU is no different. It responds to that agenda. So organising and shouting louder will certainly have your voice to be heard. The biggest challenge for me facing civil society is the danger of political co-option. I mean, if you look at issues like climate, for example, an ordinary observer might think that the battle for climate has already been won, because we have a situation where civil society organizations spearheaded the campaign for environmental change. But now it's become mainstream. Everybody is green. The whole of the European Union, we're told, is green. We have the Green New Deal. We have a just transition. We have a biodiversity strategy. But if you look at the fine print, what you see is the political establishment being forced to respond to an agenda from civil society. But if you don't keep an eye on them, while they give you the big headline of the Great Deal, but you've got to examine the small print. And I think that's the challenge for civil society organizations, because what we see is powerful interests reinventing themselves now. Everybody wants to be green. All the big multinationals want to be green. All the big polluters want to be green. There's been recent revelations of a lot of the airlines officially signing up to a new green agenda, but actually behind the scenes watering down and doing the opposite. We see the same with the Commission's proposals and the proposals coming out of the EU. They're not of a level that I think a lot of civil society would believe is sufficient. So I think the challenge is not to sort of become part of the establishment, and that can happen. Civil society organizations can be wooed in to being part of the system, whereas actually what you should be is the system's biggest, I suppose, critical friend. And that's your job. It's to hold those in power to account. And I think if civil society loses that edge, well, then we have got a serious problem. Now, from the point of view of the EU, responding to that challenge, well, in some ways, it suits those in power in the EU if civil society falls to that challenge, because there are some who want to defend the status quo, and those people don't want a vibrant and interactive civil society around. So I think what is being done, probably not enough, is there's moves to fund civil society organizations to embark in programs of education so that people know what facilities are available. And there's no doubt about it, when people connect and civil society groups get to interface more with their peers across Europe, that's where you see a real dynamic developing, because the European Union is not Brussels, even though some people might think it is. It's actually the citizens spread across Europe. So to me, how those groups interface with each other across national borders is a challenge, particularly in these COVID times, but one which has to be striven to be met. And I think there's a desire there. And maybe in this post-pandemic period, having meetings by Zoom or, electronically makes the world a smaller place and puts groups more in touch with each other, who can share information and then work together to dictate the agenda. There's no doubt about it that life in Ireland is actually more and more dictated by what is being decided in Europe. But unfortunately, the average Irish citizen is not engaged enough with what's going on here. I found that when I was in the Irish Parliament, that we were dealing with a lot of legislation that came from Europe, but kind of after the event. And that's really why we need civil society to engage. I mean, we have a scenario now where the EU was set up largely by treaties. It's not really democratically accountable in the way in which, say, a national government would be. We have elections to the European Parliament every 4 years. But it's difficult because of the lack of coverage of parliamentary issues in the media at home and so on for people to keep up with actually what is going on here. So that disconnect is there. Meanwhile, in Brussels itself, it's estimated that there are about 25,000 corporate lobbyists situated here. They come from big business, agribusiness, big tech, big energy, tobacco, free trade, big pharma, and so on. And I cannot overstate enough how big their influence is and how much money is spent by these organizations in trying to dictate EU policy. So that's the biggest reason for me why civil society needs to engage with the EU, because you are the antidote to that. You're the public interest phase and the voice of the people, if you like, to ensure that that's the dictate that's been followed here rather than corporate influence. I think we see projects underway at the moment, like the Conference on the Future of Europe. Now, this is being lauded as a great democratic project to show how willing the EU is to listen to its citizens. And you could look at it that way. And there is no doubt about it that an aspect of it is because of that. But actually, it also reflects the fact that the EU is disconnected from its citizens, and a certain panic, which gave rise as a result of the Brexit vote, with Britain deciding to leave, but also with the rise of the far right across Europe, with very low level of participation in the elections and so on. Something is clearly going wrong. But to me, that conference is really feeding into its own. So the people who are likely to engage in that conference are the people who are already kind of engaged with the EU. And I think we need to go much broader than that. We also need to look at issues like the treaties themselves, because unfortunately, the manner in which the EU is constructed means it's very much in a position to dictate economic policy. And I think many civil society organizations would see that there's an urgent need to change economic policy if we're to have an inclusive and more equal and socially just type of society. So for me, I think it couldn't be more important that people get involved and find out what's going on and empower themselves more with knowledge. I think there are some good programs and really good initiatives to be taken. I mean, if you look at it, one of the greatest achievements of the European Union was the Charter for Fundamental Rights, which is supposed to protect the rights of all citizens, including economic and social rights, because if you don't have access to a house or stable roof over your head or access to health, well, how can you really enjoy your other freedoms or be concerned about other issues and so on? So this is absolutely key. So the Charter is now 10 years old. It's what we should aspire to, but it's not where the EU is at yet. So there's been a program launched for the 10 years now to popularise the Charter more. And I had been hoped to work with the Commission, because I was the rapporteur for the European Parliament for the Fundamental Rights Report in the last year. And we'd hope to have a big event in Ireland where we'll be inviting a lot of the civil society organisations to access and make use of the Charter. The Commission is providing some funding to educate NGOs and so on in how they can use, maybe in strategic litigation, in test cases, to educate our judiciary and our legal services as to how we can make the Charter a living reality in Ireland. There's an awareness here that it's not known enough in member state legal systems, and it's not known enough by the civil society organizations on the ground who would really benefit from its rights being vindicated. So that's something that I will be working on the minute COVID lifts. I don't think we could do it just by a remote meeting, but empowering and making the Charter for Fundamental Rights a living reality in Ireland, and using EU resources to empower some of the civil society organisations to do some strategic litigation and public awareness at home, I think is going to be really key to how civil society can engage with the EU, and how people at home can see, you know what, this is something that's actually in our interests. I think that's key. And I hope COVID passes so that we can do that. sooner rather than later.